On May 27, 1896, a tornado did something almost no one thought was possible. It didn't just destroy a city. It crossed one of the widest rivers in North America, mid-storm, without losing power, and then destroyed a second city on the other side. To this day, meteorologists still call it one of the strangest, most destructive tornado paths ever recorded in American history. This is the story of the St. Louis tornado of 1896, a disaster so massive it bankrupted insurance companies, buried the truth about who really suffered the most, and quietly changed how American cities thought about disaster forever. Let's set the scene. In 1896, St. Louis was one of the largest, wealthiest cities in the entire country, the fourth largest city in America at the time, a booming industrial hub sitting right on the banks of the Mississippi River, packed with breweries, factories, and grand new buildings that announced the city's growing importance on the national stage. Just across that river, in Illinois, sat its much poorer, much rougher industrial twin, East St. Louis. A city built almost entirely around railyards, stockyards, and factories, packed with immigrant laborers working brutal hours for low pay, living in cramped housing crowded right up against the very industries that employed them. The two cities were connected by one of the engineering marvels of the era, the Eads Bridge, a massive steel structure spanning the Mississippi, considered one of the greatest bridges ever built at the time, a genuine point of civic pride, proof that American engineering could conquer even a river as powerful as the Mississippi. On the evening of May 27, after a scorching, humid day that had left much of the city sluggish and irritable, the sky over St. Louis turned an unnatural shade of green, thick and heavy in a way several residents later described in letters and interviews as unlike anything they'd witnessed before. Within minutes, a massive tornado touched down on the western edge of the city and began tearing directly through some of St. Louis's most densely populated neighborhoods, moving with a speed and ferocity that gave residents almost no time to seek any kind of shelter. Here's twist number 1, and it's the detail that still fascinates meteorologists today. This tornado didn't behave the way tornadoes are supposed to behave near large bodies of water. Conventional wisdom at the time, and honestly, for decades afterward, held that rivers this large could actually weaken or break up a tornado's structure, disrupting the warm, moist air a tornado typically feeds on. This one ignored that entirely. It tore through downtown St. Louis, ripped straight across the Mississippi River itself, maintaining its rotation over open water in a way that genuinely puzzled observers at the time, and slammed directly into East St. Louis on the other side, seemingly without losing any of its destructive power in the process. Witnesses on the Eads Bridge itself described the massive steel structure groaning and shuddering as the storm passed directly overhead, a bridge engineered to withstand nearly anything the river or weather could throw at it, suddenly feeling completely insignificant against the raw power moving through it. Remarkably, the bridge itself survived largely intact, even as everything around it seemed to be torn apart. Back in St. Louis, the tornado tore through some of the city's most crowded tenement districts, collapsing buildings onto residents with almost no warning. Massive brick structures, considered some of the sturdiest buildings in the entire city, were leveled in seconds, their walls simply folding inward under the pressure. Streetcars were thrown from their tracks and tossed like toys. Church steeples collapsed mid-service, sending congregations scrambling for cover as debris rained down through shattered windows. Entire city blocks that had stood for generations were reduced to unrecognizable piles of brick and timber within a matter of minutes. But here's twist number 2, and it's the part of this story that gets almost completely overshadowed by the more famous half of the disaster. When the tornado crossed the river into East St. Louis, it hit an area packed with railyards, factories, and densely populated immigrant housing, and the death toll there was staggering, in some tallies exceeding the losses on the St. Louis side of the river entirely. Entire trains were derailed and crushed as though they were made of tin. Railcars loaded with workers were flattened where they stood. Factory buildings collapsed onto shift workers with no time to evacuate. Because East St. Louis's population skewed heavily toward poor immigrant laborers, many of the same patterns we've seen in other American disasters repeated themselves here. Less thorough record keeping, less newspaper coverage focused on individual victims and their stories, and a death toll that historians believe was likely undercounted in the immediate aftermath, buried under a wave of coverage that focused overwhelmingly on the more prominent, wealthier destruction across the river in St. Louis proper. By the time the storm finally passed, the official death toll across both cities was recorded at approximately 255 people, with over 1,000 more injured, making it, at the time, one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history, and to this day, still one of the deadliest urban tornado strikes the country has ever experienced. Property damage was estimated at close to $13 million in 1896 money, an almost incomprehensible sum for the era, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today. And here's twist number 3, the one that connects this disaster to something much bigger than just one storm. The financial damage was so catastrophic that it genuinely destabilized the American insurance industry. Multiple insurance companies, having drastically underestimated the possibility of a disaster this severe hitting a major American city, were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy trying to cover the sudden flood of claims arriving from thousands of policyholders across both cities simultaneously. Several smaller firms reportedly folded entirely under the weight of the payouts, unable to honor the very policies they had sold. The event forced the entire insurance industry to fundamentally rethink how it calculated risk for tornadoes and severe weather in densely populated urban areas, a shift in actuarial thinking, in how companies modeled worst-case scenarios and priced policies accordingly, that quietly influenced how disaster insurance has been priced and structured across the country ever since, right up to the models insurers still rely on today. In the years following the disaster, both cities rebuilt, but along very different paths. St. Louis, wealthier and more politically influential, rebuilt relatively quickly, with new, stronger building codes eventually influenced by lessons learned from the tornado's destruction. East St. Louis, already struggling economically before the storm, took much longer to fully recover. Its already difficult conditions for immigrant laborers made even harder in the disaster's aftermath, a struggle that, in many ways, foreshadowed decades of economic hardship the city would continue to face long after the storm's damage was cleared. Today, the 1896 St. Louis tornado rarely comes up outside of serious tornado history circles, overshadowed by more recent disasters with better documentation, more dramatic footage, and simply more distance from living memory. But at the time, it stood as a stark warning that no city, no matter how modern, how wealthy, or how well engineered its bridges, was truly safe from the raw, unpredictable power of the sky above it. This is the soul of America. A nation that built bridges strong enough to connect two cities across a mighty river, only to be reminded, in a single violent evening, that nature doesn't care how impressive our engineering really is.